I'm a huge fan of Abraham Lincoln. Doesn't mean I have to be a fan of everything that Abraham Lincoln ever did or said, or for that matter, anybody else. But there's a reason why Lincoln was considered a great president, not a dictator, not a despot, but a great president. Rich Lowry, National Review Online. You wrote an excellent book, Lincoln Unbound. How are you, sir?
Good, Mark. Thanks for having me.
What motivated you to write this book?
Well, like you and like your dad, I've always been attracted to Lincoln. Always loved him, and I thought there was an aspect of him that was relatively unappreciated, although I think it's central to everything about him and everything he did, and that was the value of aspiration, which he embodied in his own life, rising literally from nothing. You know, his mom and his stepmom couldn't sign their names with an X. You know, he just has a year or so of formal schooling, and just through this relentless ethic of self-improvement, he makes the most of himself, and he has this vision of America where he wants to make it possible for everyone else in the country that has the pluck and the talent and the wherewithal and the discipline to do that. And that was really his animating vision throughout his entire life and career.
And yet, despite my age and your age, and you think you know a lot about Lincoln, you read about him and so forth, there is this new movement afoot, a couple of professors really. Some folks, I call them neo-Confederates, because I believe that's what they are, but that's just my term, who are really out to destroy Lincoln's history, destroy the events surrounding Lincoln. Do you agree with me?
I do. I think some of it, people are just misinformed, but I think some of it also is people just picking up the deceptive history that was perpetrated by ex-Confederates after the war to make the war into something it wasn't. And they denied that the war was fundamentally about slavery, which it was. You can read, the secession statements of these southern states, and they're very frank and forthright about it. They have a variety of complaints, but the main thing they say over and over again is slavery, and they fear for the future of slavery. And that was what the war was about. It wasn't about the tariff. It wasn't about centralized government. It wasn't about any of this other nonsense that some of these people talk about now.
And who attacked whom to begin the war?
Yeah, of course. Look, what does Lincoln do? He gets elected, okay? And 7 southern states leave before he's even inaugurated. And the fact is that the threat that the South felt from the North is it knew because the North had a more free market-oriented system and a more dynamic, free economy, that it was growing by leaps and bounds in every measure, whether it's manufacturing or whether it's just sheer population. Because if you're an immigrant, coming from nothing, where are you going to settle? Are you going to settle in the slave South? Or are you going to go somewhere where free labor is truly appreciated? Well, you're going to go to the North. So they feared that unless they took their opportunity to cut and run right then in 1860 or 1861, that the North would overtake them and eventually the institution of slavery would fade away, and that's what they feared most.
So Lincoln's inaugurated and the states leave, but who attacked whom?
Of course. Well, he resupplies Fort Sumter and goes out of his way. He doesn't send naval ships to bombard the people besieging Fort Sumter. He just wants to resupply it, and the Southerners, the Confederates, obviously fire the first shot.
Mm-hmm. So war breaks out. Now let's just address some of these things that he's accused of, and the context in which they come up, which is never discussed. Let's go right for it. His suspension of habeas corpus. How did that come about, and how did that end up?
Yeah, that's really the main charge against him, that he was some sort of dictator. At the beginning of the war, Washington is potentially besieged on all sides, and there are no troops to speak of there. So you need to get troops down from the north into Washington to protect the capital city of...
And let me just stop you a second. People need to understand, at that point, Washington was considered very much a southern city.
Correct. And, you can look across the river and see, and see enemy territory. So in Baltimore, Maryland, also parts of Maryland are very pro-Confederate. You have these riots that block troops coming by railroad from the north to fortify Washington. and Lincoln suspends along that railroad trunk to get the troops into Washington. And this is a response to a national crisis. Suspension of habeas corpus is in the Constitution. I don't need to tell you. You know this much better than I do. It's in Article 1, which suggests it's in congressional power, but subsequently Congress retroactively blesses Lincoln's suspension, and he undertakes a lot of other war measures before Congress is back in session because of a genuine national crisis, and Congress blesses them all retroactively. Now, subsequently, Mark, the suspensions become the norm, they become nationwide, and that's what I think was a mistake. It doesn't stand up very well in history, although the historians who've looked at it very closely say that the people who were swept up by these military courts are people who would have been arrested no matter what, whether you suspended habeas corpus or not. They're deserters, they're saboteurs. They tend to be people who are in the areas that are very most contested, like you had bitter internal civil war within Missouri, places like that.
You had chaos within towns, the same towns within the same states. And you're right, there were these transportation routes and these communication routes that were being sabotaged. Rick, I want to keep you over. I'm with Rich Lowry. I want to talk more about Lincoln. Got a lot more to discuss about Lincoln. I hope you folks will listen. The book is Lincoln Unbound, and I argue, and Rich argues, no, he was not a dictator. He wanted to be a dictator. He could have been a dictator. More when I return. A couple of quick things here. The neo-Confederates often refer to Lincoln as the great centralizer. How do you respond to that?
Well, it's true. Government grew during the war. It's just inevitable in a war of national survival. You're going to get a bigger government, and it goes back, one, fundamentally to the question of who precipitated the war, which clearly the South, and two, everything, not all of it, but most of it eroded away after the war. In 1860, the federal budget is $100 million, unbelievably. During the war, it goes up to $1 billion, which is an enormous number at the time. But 5 years later, if you exclude payments on the debt, because that was actually a time when we paid off the debt, it was down to $300 million again. Of course, we get an income tax during the war that's progressive. About 10 years after the war, that's repealed. And another thing that's very important to understand here that's often neglected, all the things they throw at Lincoln and at the North were true in the South as well, because the South was fighting a war of what it considered survival. So the South has an income tax that's highly progressive. The South has a draft. And in fact, you look at the two economies, because the North was a more dynamic and free economy, there's much less government intervention in the private economy of the North during the war than the South, where the South ends up basically having a system of war socialism before anyone had thought of that phrase by the end, where it's controlling all sorts of imports. The draft is structured in a way where the government controls basically who works where in the private economy. It ends up running the railroads. So the idea that the South is this great laissez-faire system where they just happen to own people, and that was the only thing wrong with it, is completely nonsense.
Also, I find the people who rally around the old Confederacy, the neo-Confederates, they pretend to be for the Constitution, but they're really not, are they? They're really John Calhoun followers in many ways, aren't they? Supporting nullification and secession in many respects.
That's exactly right. John Calhoun is a great intellectual light, a brilliant guy and a brilliant statesman, but hated the Constitution, hated the Federalist Papers, and wanted completely a different system. And I don't think there's a right to secession in our system. I do think...
And by the way, for the audience, neither did James Madison.
Right, the father of the Constitution. But there is, Mark, as American conservatives, we all do believe in a right to revolution. But as the Declaration says, it's not for light and transient causes. There has to be a long train of abuses. You have to have a government that's denying and taking away your natural rights. And this is a very important thing to understand about Lincoln. What do we believe as the ultimate check on government and government power? It is our inherent rights, which we get from our Creator. And the South did not believe in those natural rights for an entire category of people, and they seceded from the Union to try to protect not natural rights, but their violation of the rights of a whole category of people.
Yeah, we're not going to have enough time. But if Lincoln wanted to be a dictator, he could have been a dictator, couldn't he? I mean, there are ways to be a dictator, and he wasn't that, was he?
Yeah, well, a very important one. He could have suspended the elections of 1864. He could have said, look, there's a national emergency. We can't stand this divisiveness and all this argument. Just trust me, I'll take control. And he didn't think of doing that for a minute, even though right till the end, he thought he was going to lose that election.
Mm-hmm. He was really saved by Sherman's march through Georgia, wasn't he?
Yeah, by victories on the battlefield.
And, also, you think about, people say Lincoln didn't fight this war. You talked about the South over slavery, fought it to keep the Union together. What's interesting is Frederick Douglass initially thought that, but later he was convinced that Lincoln was, in fact, leading this war not only to save the Union, but to defeat slavery.
Yeah. A couple things. One, these neo-Confederates will also say Lincoln was a racist. And he was obviously tinged with the racial attitudes of the time. That's just part of the historical context. But Douglass said, and he ended up with a wonderful relationship with Douglass. Douglass said he was the only white man that really made him feel at ease. And when Lincoln thought he was going to lose in 1864, he had a meeting with Frederick Douglass and said, I want you to figure out how to get the word to the South about the Emancipation Proclamation to the slaves and to get them out. Get as many out as you can, because I might not be here, and I don't know who's going to be running the war afterwards. And his vision of the Union was that if you preserve the Union, then slavery will go away, because the Union is built on freedom, and if you just stop the extension of slavery, you stop feeding slavery, then it will you'll eventually be able to extinguish it. So those two visions of saving the Union and defeating slavery were, in Lincoln's mind, inherently linked together.
These people who think that or claim that Lincoln is a racist and they try to smear him, what would they say of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and the others, the founders and framers of our government, of our country? I mean, they really take up the cause of the left when they start talking like this, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. You have to consider the context of the time, but in the context of the time, Lincoln was incredibly brave on these issues. He gave a speech in Chicago right at the beginning of the campaign against Stephen Douglas, where he says, let's stop quibbling about race and which race is superior and inferior. Let's all hold to the fundamental truths of the Declaration of Independence. And Douglas took that speech just throughout the campaign, hammered Lincoln, and hammered him, and hammered him. If you read the Lincoln-Douglas debates, it's just astonishing how frankly racist Stephen Douglas is. And that's the kind of assault Lincoln was under. And occasionally in those debates, he says things that kind of make you cringe now. But most of it was a forthright defense of human equality.
Now, Ron Paul, who claims to be this great individualist, this great libertarian, and I have some questions about that personally. But that aside, you point out that he wonders why Lincoln didn't just start buying up the slaves and then freeing them. Why didn't he do that?
Well, this is really idiotic and completely ahistorical, because Lincoln was an advocate of so-called compensated emancipation all along. And he desperately wanted to buy the slaves and thought that would be, a much better way to take care of this issue. And he wanted to experiment in Delaware, a northern state, but a slave state, which seemed a pretty good test case because there weren't many slave owners as a percentage of the white population in Delaware. And Lincoln makes a very generous offer, and Delaware votes it down. So if Delaware wasn't selling, you can be, sure that Mississippi and Georgia and all these slave states in the South weren't selling. So Ron Paul, unfortunately, on that just doesn't have any idea what he's talking about.
And Lincoln, if he hadn't been assassinated, things would have turned out very differently post-Civil War, don't you think?
I do. He never would have let himself get separated from the Republicans in Congress and alienated from them the way Andrew Johnson did. And Lincoln had a lot of problems with Republicans in Congress during his time in office at various times. They thought he was going too slow, and they were impatient with him, but they always ended up kind of fundamentally in the same place, although Lincoln's tactics might have been different.
I also think people need to understand that when Lincoln was president, the federal government didn't have clean hands when it came to slavery. We have the 2 fugitive slave laws. We have the District of Columbia, which had very racist laws and so forth and so on. So it wasn't as if the federal government was all united in this position, correct?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is another reason why.
And let me interrupt myself. And, of course, we had the Supreme Court that a few years earlier had issued the Dred Scott decision. That is a federal Supreme Court, even though the Chief Justice was from South Carolina. Yeah,
that's exactly right. Well, this is another reason that the case for secession was so weak. The Southerners dominated the federal government, all during the early days of the nation. And this is another way that the Confederacy was hypocritical. They said retrospectively it's all about states' rights. But what did they want? They wanted a federal Fugitive Slave Act and federal enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act. And one of the demands of the Southern Fire Eaters was that you would get federal protection of slavery in the territories. So they were in favor of state rights exactly to the extent it favored the interests of slavery and no more.
Well, what do you think the modern-day neo-Confederates are all about? They claim to be constitutionalists. I reject that. I think they're really into the Articles of Confederation.
I think that's right. They basically think the country took a wrong turn, not the way many of us do, the last 70 years or pick your date, but took a wrong turn right at the beginning. And the American project is somehow fundamentally corrupt at its root. And a corollary of that is that this great American hero and great American statesman, Abraham Lincoln, is really nefarious, noxious figure who is a dictator in keeping with this wrong turn that America took right at the beginning.
And Rich Lowry, it's an odd thing. Some of these people, they will defend Vladimir Putin. I mean, some of the same people are out there defending Putin while they're trashing Lincoln. How do you square that one?
Yeah, it makes absolute no sense. Mm-hmm. And it goes to a kind of a willingness to side with the country's enemies that you see on the left. Now, the enemies they may be drawn to may be different than the enemies that the left likes, but it's kind of in the same family of phenomena, I think.
William F. Buckley, Jr., who founded the publication that you now run, what was his view of Lincoln?
He loved him, and particularly as a student of the English language, loved the words and loved the writing and loved the speeches. And as I immersed myself in those when I wrote the book, I was actually at times reminded of Buckley because Lincoln was such an incisive polemicist. There's such a cutting edge, and it cut so deep. At the same time, there was a great wit. So there's really a Buckley-esque quality to that, I think. And Lincoln, he really had the best education you possibly can as a writer because he was soaked in the King James version of the Bible and soaked in Shakespeare. And if you want to be a master of rhetoric, those are two pretty good places to start.
But Buckley was he would defend Lincoln against some of the bright lights of his day, wouldn't he?
Yes, and this is something where there were some intellectuals associated with National Review at its beginning who were very hostile to Lincoln and thought he was the forebear to the New Deal, and Buckley pushed back against that. And I just think it's nonsense. I mean, it is true, Mark, and you said at the beginning of our conversation, you don't have to defend or like everything about Lincoln. He certainly was more pro-government than you are or than I am, but it was a different time. There's nothing like the federal welfare state we have now, and Lincoln's government interventions were meant to support and create a dynamic economy at a time when there was, we didn't really have a sophisticated financial system. There weren't any great industrialists. So if you're going to build a railroad, you may need government subsidies, but that doesn't mean, he would have supported AFDC or massive transfer payments of the sort we have now, because he was a great individualist who really, in the marrow of his bones, rejected class warfare and envy because one of his foremost values was individual striving and responsibility.
The book is Lincoln Unbound. You know, Rich Lowry, I believe that these neo-Confederates, they could pick apart any single framer of the Constitution if they really chose to do so, or any single president of the United States, even the early ones, if they chose to do so, for the very reason you said, that they believed the founding itself was poisonous, that it got off on the wrong track. It immediately got off on the wrong track. And when you read Madison's letters, whether it's to Jefferson or to many others, he's in the thick of this fight till the day he dies for the nullifiers and the secessionists and so forth, and he's battling them constantly. So in any event, I want to thank you. This is really a wonderful book, Lincoln Unbound.
Thanks, Mark. Can I ask you a favor before we go?
Sure.
My mother-in-law is one of your biggest fans, so you'll get me some credit if you'll say, Lorraine, let me tell you, Rich isn't so bad.
Lorraine, Rich is a wonderful guy. Leave Rich alone. Leave it to me to spank him every now and then. No. No, Rich is a good guy. Rich, I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Mark.
And Lorraine, I appreciate it too. God bless.
Thanks, Mark.
All right, take care. I'm tough on these guys sometimes, I know it.